Yesterday, I found out that Ozzy Osbourne passed away. And to a lot of you, that means nothing. To some of you, it might mean something. If you're not a fan of people who use pop culture to, you know, preach a Bible message, or if you think that people capitalize on current events, then you don't need to watch the rest of this. And I kind of understand where you're coming from. I just want to offer a little bit of perspective because, and I've seen some ministers' reactions like, oh, when I was younger, I listened to this and I loved this and this was great. But I look at it now and I think, man, what a waste of time, what a horrible message and content. And, that's what they're saying. And if you're saying that, all I'm really trying to do is offer a counterpoint because, in my understanding, every bit of truth is God's truth. Like, we don't have to diminish people who have a bit of a truth in their message. In Acts 17, Paul quotes the pagan philosophers. He's not blanket endorsing them. He's just saying, even your own poets have said, we are the offspring of God. I like to say that I left the Baptist church and came into the Church of Christ, years later. But in between, like Ozzy said, rock and roll was my religion and my law. I was much more interested in looking through classic rock and learning more and more about it and collecting albums than I was, anything having to do with religion. I listened to Paranoid, like the album, on the way home yesterday on my commute. Like I was just shutting everything out. Like it did hurt me, and it might not matter to me as a Christian in a lot of ways, but it was kind of emotional. But as someone who is somewhat more familiar with Black Sabbath and Ozzy Osbourne's discography, I think a few years ago I was looking on Spotify. I wanted to do a dive and just listen to every album I could and pick out some songs from my playlist that I wasn't familiar with before and things of that nature. I've shared the lyrics to After Forever before. That's actually from their fourth album, where Ozzy says something along the lines of, talking about God above and God is the only way to love. And that was actually written by their bassist, Geezer Butler, because they were making music that was kind of based off of horror movies and, Sabbath and figures and wizards and all sorts of things. And people thought that they themselves were satanic. And Geezer's like, no, that's not the case. So they wrote a song about God. And as I looked into that yesterday, it seems like there was a lot of just them being upset at the way that religious people were fighting and the whole Ireland thing, which, if you don't know anything about that, I don't need to go into it now. But just people fighting each other, like going to war over religion. And that's really what the core was about, which in itself is a message worth discussing. But just to hear, like, Black Sabbath saying God's the only way to love, like, a lot of Black Sabbath fans are not going to be fans of that message either. Years ago, when I was a campus minister, the Sabbath put out 13. It was one of those, like, we haven't gotten together in a long time, we're going to put an album together. And there's a song called God is Dead, but it's God is Dead with a question mark. Like, it kind of goes back and forth, the struggle of not knowing whether there's a God or not. And I played it before and after my radio program. Like, I thought, this is something that you don't normally hear from people who aren't Christian. You don't hear this question, is there a God? Isn't there a God? But back to Paranoid, back to the song War Pigs explicitly, because there's just a handful of songs that I think about when they come across the radio. It's not a hint of the gospel, but there's just a sliver of truth in there. I'm not going to compare like other bands or other songs I'm thinking of, but when I hear War Pigs and I hear that God's calling on the day of judgment and those who send people out to war and profit off of it and just let everyone, meet their end and are just sitting back and not caring about it, God's judgment's finally going to come to them. And I don't believe Satan's laughing on the day of judgment. But it's something to think about. And the problem with War Pigs, the way it presents God's judgment, is as if we're going to be on the sidelines seeing people who are evil get what they deserve. As I'm reading through Romans, the first few chapters, and I was preparing for sermons in the book of Romans, you really get the sense Paul's concerned that there are people who are going to say, I can't wait till the day of judgment when God's going to destroy and punish all these people, as if they're not under the same condemnation, as if, they could do anything or live their life in such a way to be to not have to stand before God in judgment. So God's judgment is not like it's a sliver of truth. It's not a sliver of the gospel. It's not like people are hearing the gospel when they hear that song or when they hear other songs that talk about things like that. The gospel starts with a proper understanding that none of us can stand before God in judgment without the grace and the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ. I said a whole lot in a few short minutes, and some people probably won't have any concern even if they did stay to listen for the whole thing. All I'm really saying is if you're going to post about it, if you're going to complain about Ozzy or complain about Black Sabbath or complain about the message and all this, and I'm not saying you shouldn't feel that way or shouldn't do that, but think about if you do have that conversation, if someone else approaches that conversation, think about what I've said. Think about the perspective of someone who undoubtedly changed the course of rock and roll and heavy metal, along with others in the band. It wasn't a solo effort. I'm not saying that. Let's just think about things and put some things in perspective and understand where people are coming from if we're going to approach that subject and have those conversations.